You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of these are the beginning of birth pains. This passage is from the book of Matthew in the New Testament, Matthew 24, 6 through 8. And the reason why I start with that is because of the ominous nature that the ominous nature of any conversation surrounding the concept of civil war or fifth generational warfare or the signs of the times. When I this well, before we get any further, this is the Redacted Culture Cast. Thank you for listening. Today is Friday, and it is episode 60 of our show. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being a part of it. So, to get to the point and to get to the question of why I would start with a passage from Matthew is because regardless of your religious position, when it comes to religions like Christianity or Islam, or if you consider yourself atheist, there is a sense of impending purpose and doom written into so much of what we think about and what we believe, that so you might even say that it is written into our nature, that all of reality and everything that we live for is pointed at something, pointed towards maybe some end, some goal, some meaning. The great crisis of the 21st century is not a crisis of material need for the West, but a crisis of meaning, of purpose, of direction, of gravitas, as you might say. And I wanted to start today's conversation on the topic of civil war with a passage from the Bible that implies a sense of foreboding, because I think that does explain the spirit of the age, and whether or not it is true to some sort of reality that we are in the timeline of the New Testament that points at the second coming of Christ, or if it is simply a way of explaining what it feels like to live in the Americas in 2023. The goal and the point of it is to identify how we think about civil war in questions. For example, what is the likelihood of civil war is a question that comes across the internet quite frequently, but it also does in at bars, in dining room tables, in places where friends meet together at the range or whatever. And that is also paired with the question of what is civil war. Admittedly, the word civil war is currently the phrase civil war, the words civil war, is currently part of kind of the zeitgeist of our day. It's a popular term that is being used frequently, whether it's from people like Tim Pool to Twitter to social media to classic media to books being written to just how we think about it, whether it's be fifth generational warfare, political conflict, civil war, cold cultural civil war, culture war, and all of these conflicts related. And I wanted to participate and contribute a series of investigations, that's not the right word, inquiries into how we think about war and how we think about conflict, and see how that applies to this idea of civil war, and hopefully leave the end of the day with a sense of maybe not providing a grand scheme answer, but a tool, a philosophical tool that's useful for sorting out information that produces false urgency for the sake of maybe marketing, maybe clicks and views, maybe pseudo religious elements, maybe the apocalypticism is itself a little bit too attractive. And then also so that we can, as we move forward as a people, as individuals, as a culture, as gun culture, can move forward and look at how we perceive news and media and conversation and our friends and our family, and how we talk about these things in a way that adds substance to something that otherwise tends to lead to just perhaps desperation in any way, shape, or form. None of us are unfamiliar with the idea of panic buying. And the antidote to panic buying isn't only being prepared physically, but the antidote to panic buying is having a framework, a worldview, so to speak, that you observe the world through that allows you to navigate these things better. That being the case, we have to start with the question of what is a civil war. And if you ever want to, be that kind of thorn in the side as either a philosopher or to a philosopher, you say, well, we must define our terms. And the very nature of what we call civil war in the day and age that we live in, very much so, strains the ability to be defined. And I don't think that's a bug. I think that's a feature because you have things like a organization that isn't an organization referred to as Antifa, which is a decentralized network that isn't a network, organizing while not organizing, using bringing lawyers and advocates and political advocacy to a location to use non-weapons referred to as Molotov cocktails and firebombs and explosives to cause harm to people to prevent them from building a building. How could you say that is or is not a form of conflict? Is it an insurgency? Is it a warfare tactic? Is it a what is it, right? How do you understand this thing? Or another example that's obviously still in the media somehow is the so-called insurgency of January 6th, which is sort of an affront to the cathedral in one way, or how you talk about it tends to reveal more about what you think than what we know about what's on the ground, and whether you're on the Tucker Carlson side or the opposing side. The issue that we're presented with the January 6th event is it's no longer nothing. But it's either something because of people storming a Capitol or because of the story about what people say are the people storming the Capitol. And so whether or not it was an event to be recognized, it has become an event worthy of recognition due to all of the perhaps political malfeasance participating within. So let's start with the question of what is a civil war? I think very simply it is conflict involving violence amongst a population that falls under a certain government or nation state that arises to the level of violence in order to change or produce political change within the country. That's a very loose definition, a bit of a off the tongue, off the top of the head definition. But one way that we could define a civil war is a war not between two governments, but within the population that is under one government. And it might be undergone. It might be engaged between, let's just say, an establishment in a revolutionary party. It may be engaged between two factions within a population or a country. But the primary question regarding what a civil war is that we have the convenience of the primary question of the the problem of answering the question of what is a civil war is that we are capable of looking back in history. We are capable of looking back and say that was a civil war, but while it's happening, it's much more difficult. We recently took a vacation to the deep south, where there you can find remnants of uh, arguments saying that it wasn't that the first American Civil War, if you want to call it that, was not actually a civil war. It was a war of northern aggression, or it was a war of independence, second war of independence. You could make there are examples within even American history where people's parties and groups still do not see the American Civil War as actually a civil war, but rather a more of an invasion. And you can probably go on Twitter and Reddit and find people who comment on how, let's say, if a state secedes, then the other states have the right to invade that state militarily and reclaim its natural resources and working population for the greater United States, which wouldn't be a civil war, it would be an invasion. So if Ukraine wants to leave Russia, or it wants to be does not want to be a part of the Soviet Union or whatever it is, it's considered an invasion. If Russia invades Ukraine, but it's not somehow an unjustified invasion if America wants to invade Texas. That would be a parallel example. And so this is where so while we do have the benefit of retrospect to look at, or maybe even just being an outside observer of a civil war in a foreign country, inside our own country, it's much more difficult to identify. And that again hints to that opening passage of you will hear of wars and of rumors of wars. And this is to point out how, as this may become an explanation piece or an example of how, when we think about civil war, really we're caught between a very difficult question of the perpetual man with butterfly meme, is this civil war kind of problem. And it ends up drawing kind of an intellectual continuum where um how we define civil war either ends up with one one problem. It tends towards, I don't want to say it's ultimately, but I want to say it tends towards one of two problems. On the one hand, that how we think about civil war and how we try to define it, whether it's brother against brother, government against people, people against people, government against government within the United States, we end up with a question of either it isn't happening now, but it will happen, therefore we have to prepare, with no clear definition of when it is. There's no line in the sand that says we have crossed it. So you end up with this problem, or you end up with the other problem with everything that is going on is civil war, and therefore nothing is. And so this isn't meant to be this. These are two examples of how thoughts or meditations on civil war and the potentiality of civil war, as well as discussions regarding civil war in the United States, tend to kind of reduce into these intellectual problems of well, what we're what we are encountering now, what we're in 2023, does not quite qualify as civil war, but it counts as an indicator of potential civil war. And therefore, in the progression of, say, the last 3 years, we could come to the conclusion that we are moving in the direction of a legitimate hot civil war, or something that will be in retrospect looked at and described as a civil war, even though we don't know what the terms would look like. That we're moving in that direction. Car passing. That we are moving in that direction, though we're not exactly sure when we will have crossed the line, and therefore we are caught with the perpetual being prepared thing, which unfortunately, um, which is sort of like it's not very fulfilling. It doesn't seem to answer the question. It just seems to perpetually add urgency without ever giving an answer. And then the other side of the opposite, and in opposite of it is, well, um, outside of flat denial that there isn't any conflict going on in the United States, which wouldn't be that's a straw man. I presented a straw man. I have to recognize that that's what that is. But the other side of it is the other way that this kind of question on trying to define civil war ends up with being is it kind of reduces into this problem of everything that we see is civil war, and therefore none of it is. And that would be every single thing that we perceive. This would be the monomania problem. We have the perpetual future problem and the monomania problem. And the perpetual future problem is the perpetual prepper problem of sort of a jockeying for preparedness, which also turns out to be sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy issue, an arms race of sorts of ideologies to say we must prepare for the pending civil war, while in fact you're actually producing it. Um, Ergo, we're being oppressed, therefore, or we will be oppressed, therefore we must produce the means of oppression kind of question. The other one is everything is civil war. Everything that we see is culture war. Everything that we see is politics. War is politics by another mean ad infinitum, not as limited as Clausewitz. And both of these issues, well, the one side, the perpetual not yet approach to civil war, produces a perpetual false sense of urgency, perhaps a false motivation, and then the everything is yet nothing is results in a monomania of everything is perceived through the lens of it being already determined as civil war. So, why do I bring these up in reference to Matthew 24? When Jesus is making his claim to the apostles, he's saying that there will be wars and rumors of wars, nation will fight against nation, and so long and so forth. And what he is saying is that you will see it, but this also comes at the time of Jesus saying, "No man knows when the end will come." And Jesus is in this reference. He's making. I'm using him as an authority in this example, making a statement to the apostles that you must focus on the gospel, focus on doing the thing now, doing what you do now, living now, as opposed to perpetually living for the potential apocalypse, knowing that it will come, uh, and not be caught in simply um, trying to perpetually interpret when it's happening. He said that by its very nature, it will be it will deny or challenge identification. You'll have wars and rumors of wars. You'll have all of these things going on, and it will look like this. It will look like a storm of perpetual now but not yet kind of issue. So, rather, our the attention, the urgency, the sense of urgency that comes to civil war, though does it not though in contrast, it is comes up oftentimes in the question of what would civil war look like, or what is the likelihood of civil war. And in gun culture specifically, we are both subject to a series of very, very poorly founded accusations, like, for example, gun culture is preparing for a civil war. No, gun culture isn't. There may be individuals within gun culture who exhibit these activities, but it's not the same thing as if they're preparing as in they're planning to facilitate it. Um, and yet we know that I'm sure many of us have met people who have sort of dedicated elements of their lives to being prepared for a potential civil war. And I can think of this even in my own life. A certain element of my life is prepared for natural and man-made natural and man-made disasters, or the consequences of man's decisions. Right? It might be civil unrest. It might be in market crunch. It's hard to get ammunition, so I have had opportunities to acquire some, but it's not. But even then, the preparation itself is not sufficient. It is not a sufficient form of motivation. Maybe I motivate to be prepared for something, but I'm not. But that is not itself motivation. Indicators of civil war, though, that we live in, that we might observe, is the presence of insurgency within the United States. And I'm not talking about the January 6th insurgency. I'm talking about movements, things disguising themselves as movements who advocate for violent change within the country. And they advocate for and even participate in it by, burning down buildings and stuff like that. There is also, an ideological challenge, maybe an intellectual insurgency within academia, which seeks to make part of American education a self whipping perpetuity kind of problem of like, you might say that there's an insurgency within academics to implant a sense of self-loathing within American people. It's not universal. It happens on a case by case basis. So you could say that the presence of Antifa as a organization active in the United States could be a sign of insurgency. You could say the Proud Boys are a form of insurgency. You could say that foreign entities funding organizations to commit acts of domestic terrorism in the United States would be considered forms of insurgency. We go on and on and on. Challenge of insurgency is that it's by its nature, it is seeking to avoid definition. By its very nature, an insurgency is effective when it undermines the the population's trust in government, and it does this through avoiding presenting barriers to identification. It's sort of this perpetual boogeyman problem, which does lead to the problem of monomania, seeing all things as an insurgency. We'd have to be careful there. But we also see the weaponization of political punishment. We see factions within the government using the apparatus of government to attack political enemies. The ATF the ATF's brace ruling is an example of this. It is a political attack against political opponents because the left has identified that the AR-15 is the firearm of the right. They've done it themselves. The right never did it themselves. This was the left's decision. And then they use that anyway to attack that tool. Turns out to be a method to attack their political opponents. This is punishment by process. So we are seeing what would look like, or what could be referred to as indicators of civil war, which ultimately, or which leave us in this kind of limbo state. And that oftentimes boils down to, on an individual level, a sort of crisis question of, when do we do something? We don't even, and the problem is that we don't even know what it is. Or oftentimes, people will present things and they'll be wild and violent and kind of fanciful, right? This is why when gun culture hears somebody advocating a little too loudly for something like political violence, we don't like it. We're not okay with that, and we know it. We really do police our own in that sense. And when elements of gun culture tends to sees people, one way we police it is they tend to be glowies. They tend to be observed as instigators. They tend to be viewed or discovered to be, or perceived as, what do you call it, bad actors, or saboteurs, people who are in infiltrating grassroots movements to turn them into extremist organizations. And so this there are, we know that gun culture is against calls for violence. We generally oppose this, and we generally oppose. And when I say we, I'm saying in not a prescriptive sense. I'm saying in a descriptive sense. I can say that gun culture generally, in most cases, if not all cases, the vast majority, in fact, almost as a moral code, denounces calls for violence. So if somebody calls for violence, there's usually there's a certain amount of, no, we don't do that here. This also points to some of the ethos of what is present within gun culture. For example, act, don't talk. Irony coming from a guy running a podcast, I know. And so there are this issue of civil war, and the conversation around civil war is a difficult conversation to have, because on the underlying layer of it, it is asking ourselves, how do we organize ourselves in society? Whether it's social contract theory, whether it's just relationships, whether it's government and elections, whether it's whatever, what we're running into a problem is that we have this general feeling that whatever we have is not working, which raises a problem. And it raises a serious problem. So, when it comes to the conversation about civil war, one warning and one thing worth considering is, how do we approach the presented sense of urgency that is part and parcel to gun culture? Not part and parcel to gun culture, part and parcel to the conversation on civil war. How do we look at urgency? Do we want the sense of urgency that comes with the, okay, I no longer have that, or do we want the sense of urgency, or the simplicity of the fantasy world where, okay, the negotiation phase is over, now we get to return to maneuvering platforms? And I want to, I want to, this is similar to the question of who is allowed in gun culture conversation. I want to pull back the layer one more time. And I want to pull back our focus on gun culture to try to accurately describe the way that I think it makes us feel. The language that the way that we live in, the sort of Overton window of the day, can be one described as being caught between two forms of tyranny. On the one side of tyranny, we have the tyranny of nothing, the tyranny that comes from doing nothing. This is the slow creep and demolition of the things that we see as valuable, whether it is the increase of crime in your city, whether it is that form of lawlessness becoming the new normal. It is the removal of economic stability. It is the demonization of neighbors and populations that become the de rigueur. It becomes the norm. It becomes the everyday. It is this. So there's this urgency of doing nothing. If I do nothing, if we do nothing, the corruption will continue. Whatever you want to say, I'm using whatever you want to say it. There is a positive sense of urgency. Well, this is a negative sense of urgency. Sorry, there is a negative sense of urgency. There is a tyranny presented of if we do nothing, it will only get worse, which is contrasted by I kind of botched the phrasing, so I'm going to pull back once again. We seem to be caught in between two potential tyrannies. One, the tyranny of doing nothing, that all of the things that all of your values, all your rights, all of the things that you want to pass on to your children, your freedoms will be eroded over time if we do nothing. And the other side and that is opposed, that is contrasted by the tyranny of I want to call it the tyranny of urgency, and I'm trying to. This is the hardest one of the tyranny of authority. This is the it's gonna cost something to make a change, and that cost is most often that cost of change is most often shouted loudly by the people who have the least to lose. So when a politician goes to Minneapolis and starts calling for burning buildings to the ground, they're going to retreat to safety, and they have the freedom of their advocacy because of their political position, and they're protected by politics and class and race or whatever you want to call it. You have the pundits issue. You have this tyranny of um, the French Revolution, the reign of terror. On the one hand, if we do nothing, it will only get worse. And on the other hand, if we do something, it will guaranteed get much worse very quickly. The These are the two kind of opposing, stretching, contrasting concerns that we exist in. If we do nothing, it's only going to get worse. And if we do something, whatever something is, whether it's is casually, I don't know, casually, I can't not strawman it. I can't not strawman it right now. This idea of like we're gonna form a new militia and we're gonna win back the government. Like no 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 no, because that is what you need to have all of your values targeted publicly. And I'm saying that's bad strategy. Great motivation, terrible strategy. Thank you very much. And also I question your values. Which is more important to you, vengeance or virtue? That being the case, in between these two tyrannies, what we can do and what we can look across the world is recognize that there are players. I think one of the challenges that the modern world has presented to the world is everything and nothing is everything and nothing at the same time. We are much closer to the side of everything is fascism, therefore nothing is fascism. Everything is tyranny, therefore nothing is tyranny. Everything is civil war, therefore nothing is civil war. We have to be willing to define the actors, and those are That is a hard question, and we have to be able to do it without dehumanizing each other, and then we have to be able to do it with understanding things like criminality, and we need to start producing antidotes to fifth generational warfare. We need to present an antidote to fifth generational warfare. We can't just say everything is fifth generational warfare. We have to create an appropriate response. And because fifth generational warfare, what we're referring to as fifth generational warfare, or fifth generation warfare, whatever you want to call it, because that format and that generation of warfare particularly affects and attacks the citizens, it is more total war than Napoleonic total war. Because of that, then the response has to come from the citizenry. And that is where gun culture resides. The fundamental tool of what I would refer to as fifth generational warfare is the infection of ideology. The infection of ideology to convince populations of monomanias that are self-destructive. It is to have the anti-fascisms, the people who refer to themselves as anti-fascists, fight on the side of fascism. It is to it is to instigate elements of law to be antithetical to law. In other words, fifth generational warfare is not the destruction of values, but the corruption of them, the antithesis of values. It is to say everything that you call good is actually evil, and everything that you call evil is actually good. And so the solution to this on the citizen level is to be attentive to what you understand is right and true and good. The solution to fifth generational warfare is to be a part of your culture. Complaining about the isolation that happens through social media does not produce the antidote to that. Referencing and identifying things as acts of civil war do not produce the antidote to it. And an antidote to something like an insurgency is identifying the insurgent and excluding them from your sphere, which sounds an awful lot like who is and isn't in gun culture. And I think a point of contention that identifies this subject is how gun culture reacts to open calls for civil war. If the left does it, no one cares, right? Malcolm Nance writes a book arguing for basically democide of his own of the American population, not a blink in the eye. Whereas some random user on Twitter makes an aggressive, and I say random user on Twitter, we know who we are. Somebody makes a statement that's a little too grandiose, and his own people go, hey, back up, man, back down a little bit. The thing that we've learned about people who are capable of violence is that that generally speaking, people who are capable of violence are also capable of evaluating the level of violence accepted for the scenario. And that is not to say that we are not in a civil war. I am going to say that we are in an era where the old model of civil war does not work anymore. The idea that it is simply organized armies against organized armies is not sufficient. We are in a conflict for the soul. And that sounds really pretty, right? Joe Biden said that. Well, Joe Biden is sort of the antichrist in this regard. He's the one arguing that he has the answer. I'm not saying he's, literally the antichrist. That's kind of ridiculous, but clip it and make me the bad guy. Go ahead. I got you, bud. So what that means for us is in our day-to-day lives, identify the players in your own community, in your own neighborhood, in your own family, in your own friends, and be a little bit more open about that. Now that's going to look like having some hard conversations with yourself. And it doesn't mean that we're the judge, jury, and executioner. Please don't become that foolish. You and I know it's foolish. We also know it's immoral. Don't go down that road. But when we think about civil war, we know we can start identifying tools for evaluating questions. And one of them would be, well, this tool that we've exampled of mono. Sorry, we can identify two tools for engaging in the conversation of civil war. Is one, the sense of urgency, being able to identify something like that, and two, monomania. I talk about monomania pretty regularly, and our monomania is that sort of thing which consumes a person to see everything through a a conspiratorial worldview, and that would be unfortunate. I mean, a really good example of it is how like certain or like how uh, race-based left-wing organizations wield the word racism. Everything is racism. If I can identify it as racism, they see the world through a monomania of racism. And so, that being said, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for listening into this conversation on the topic of civil war. With that being the case, we're signing out saying, uh, be prepared, but don't be consumed by preparation. You must live today in your community. And so, that being said, we're signing off. Talk to you later.